There's something interesting about certain people. They walk into a room and they just notice things. The tension nobody's talking about. The sadness hiding behind a smile. We're usually told this is a gift, this ability to see what others miss. But I want to suggest something different, that this same ability, this sharp awareness, might actually be one of the more difficult things you can carry. I'm not talking about danger in the usual sense, not physical harm. I'm talking about something quieter and more corrosive. The risk of becoming so aware that you lose access to that blissful ignorance that lets most people live relatively peaceful lives. Have you ever watched people at a party? Really watch them. They're playing a game. Everyone knows the rules. Someone asks how you are, you say fine, and everyone accepts that as enough. You compliment the host. You laugh at jokes that aren't that funny. You nod sympathetically at stories you've heard before. It's this collective agreement to stay on the surface, to keep things pleasant, to not look too closely. Then there's you, the person who sees past all of this. You notice the wife who flinches slightly when her husband speaks. You pick up on the colleague who's deeply lonely despite being surrounded by friends. You feel the anxiety moving through the room like something invisible but very real. This is where things get tricky, because once you see these things, you can't unsee them. And what's more, your very presence becomes this kind of mirror that people find uncomfortable to look at. Let me explain. When you see clearly, when you pick up on the hidden dynamics underneath social interactions, you're essentially pointing to what everyone has silently agreed to ignore. And people really don't like that, not because they're stupid or cruel, but because your awareness threatens the very system that helps them function. Think of it like this. Society is kind of like theater. Everyone has their role. The successful professional, the devoted parent, the reliable friend. These are personas, right? Masks we wear. And the show runs smoothly as long as everyone stays in character. But you, with your sharp awareness, are like someone in the audience who stands up mid-performance and says, but that's just acting. You can imagine how popular that makes you. So the first risk is isolation, not the regular loneliness of not having enough friends. I mean something deeper, the isolation of living in a completely different reality from everyone around you. You're speaking a language nobody else understands. You're seeing a world nobody else can see. And the painful irony is that the more clearly you see, the more alone you become. I knew someone once, let's call her Sarah, who had this incredible ability to read people. She could walk into a room and immediately sense who was genuine and who was performing, who was hurting and who was pretending to be fine, who to trust and who was hiding something. And what happened? She lost every close relationship she had. Not because she was mean or judgmental, but simply because people felt exposed around her. They couldn't maintain their comfortable masks in her presence. Her friends would say things like, "You're too intense. You overthink everything. Can't you just relax and have fun?" But she couldn't, because seeing clearly isn't something you turn on and off. It's like asking someone with hearing to just ignore sound. Once you've developed this capacity for perception, it's always there, always working, always revealing what others would prefer, stayed hidden. And here's the second risk. When you see the truth of things, when you perceive what's really happening beneath the surface, you face this terrible choice. Do you speak up or stay silent? If you speak up, you risk getting attacked. And I mean this literally, though the attack is usually psychological rather than physical. You'll be called negative, oversensitive, a troublemaker. You'll be accused of creating problems that don't exist, of seeing hostility in innocent situations, of being unable to just let things be. But if you stay silent, if you suppress what you see and pretend not to notice, you start losing touch with yourself. Because every time you ignore your own perception, every time you accept someone else's version of reality when you know it's false, you're basically telling yourself that your experience isn't valid. And over time, this creates this kind of split inside you. One part knows the truth, but another part has to pretend not to. It's a particularly quiet form of madness. I remember years ago, sitting in a meeting where everyone was celebrating how well a certain project was going, and I could see with perfect clarity that the whole thing was about to fall apart. The signs were everywhere, the forced optimism, the avoidance of certain topics, the way people's eyes would dart away when difficult questions came up. But when I gently suggested that maybe we should look at some concerning patterns, I was met with hostility, not argument, not rational disagreement, just defensive anger. And this brings us to the third risk, the sneakiest one. When you see clearly and others don't want to see, they'll often turn their anger on you. Not consciously, maybe. They won't deliberately choose to make you the villain, but unconsciously, reflexively, they'll start treating you as the problem, as if your perception is creating the very issues you're just pointing out. This is what I call shooting the messenger. When someone points out that the emperor has no clothes, the crowd doesn't thank them for the truth. The crowd attacks them for ruining the comfortable illusion everyone was enjoying. Your clarity becomes a threat, and threats need to be neutralized or controlled. I've seen this pattern repeat over and over. The person who sees clearly gets labeled. They're too negative, they're creating drama, they're unstable, they need to lighten up, they're paranoid. Notice how all these labels have one thing in common. They all suggest that the problem is in the perceiver, not in what's being perceived. It's a clever defense mechanism, really. If we can convince you that your perception is flawed, we never have to look at what you're perceiving. But here's what nobody talks about. The fourth risk is maybe the most devastating of all. When you're constantly picking up on the emotional states and hidden truths of everyone around you, when you're always sensing what's unspoken and unfelt, you start losing track of what's actually yours. Your own feelings get tangled up with everyone else's. You walk into a room feeling perfectly fine and leave feeling inexplicably anxious or sad or angry. And you can't tell if these feelings are yours or if you've just absorbed them from the environment, like a sponge soaking up water. This is exhausting in a way that's hard to describe. Imagine never quite knowing which thoughts are yours, never being sure whether the emotion you're feeling is yours or the person's next to you. It's like trying to hear your own voice in a room full of people all talking at once. Eventually, you might forget what your voice even sounds like. I've talked to people who experience this, and they often say the same things. I feel like I'm disappearing, like there's less and less of me and more of everyone else, and this isn't metaphorical. This is a real psychological risk. When the boundaries between self and other become too porous, when you're absorbing too much without enough protection, you can actually lose touch with your own center, your own identity. Now you might be thinking, well, this all sounds pretty grim. Is there any hope for people who see clearly? And here's where we get to something interesting, because the danger I'm describing is only dangerous when it's unconscious, when you don't understand what's happening to you, when you think you're going crazy or that there's something wrong with you. But once you understand the dynamic, once you recognize that your clarity isn't a flaw but a particular kind of awareness, everything shifts, not because the perception stops, but because your relationship to it changes. You start realizing that you're not required to save everyone from their blindness. You don't have to point out every hidden truth or fix every unacknowledged problem. You see, the truly dangerous thing isn't the perception itself. It's the compulsion to act on what you perceive. The belief that if you see a problem, you must solve it. If you sense someone's pain, you must fix it. If you notice a group's dysfunction, you must correct it. This is where the real trouble begins, because you're essentially taking responsibility for things that aren't yours to fix. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're walking by a river and you notice the water is muddy. You can see this clearly. Everyone else walking by seems not to notice or not to care. Now you have a choice. You can jump into the river and try to clear it with your hands, stirring it up more in the process, exhausting yourself in an impossible task. Or you can simply acknowledge that the water is muddy, maybe note that it would be wise to wait before drinking from it, and continue on your way. The water will clear itself when conditions are right. Your frantic stirring won't help. In fact, it'll make things worse. This is the wisdom that has to come with clear perception, the understanding that not everything you see requires your intervention. But here's the paradox. Once you stop trying to fix everything you see, once you relax into just being aware without the compulsion to change or control, your perception often becomes even sharper. And more than that, people start feeling safer around you because you're no longer unconsciously demanding that they see what you see or change to match your awareness. Think about it like this. When you meet someone who sees you clearly but doesn't need you to be different, who recognizes your struggles without trying to rescue you, who understands your fears without needing you to face them on their schedule, how does that feel? It feels like relief, doesn't it? Like you can finally breathe. This is what clear perception can become when it's held properly. Not a weapon you use against others' blindness, but a gift you offer through your presence. You see them fully, and in that seeing, you let them be exactly as they are. This doesn't mean you condone everything or pretend problems don't exist. It means you've stopped making their blindness your personal project. I want to be really clear about something. I'm not saying you should become cold or indifferent. I'm not suggesting you stop caring about people or turn away from real suffering. What I'm saying is that there's a difference between compassionate awareness and compulsive fixing, between seeing clearly and making yourself responsible for what you see. The danger of seeing what others don't lies not in the seeing itself, but in what you do with it. If you use it to separate yourself, to feel superior, to justify your loneliness, then yes, it becomes dangerous. If you use it to attack others for their blindness, to shame them for not seeing, to punish them for their unconsciousness, then yes, it destroys connections and leaves you isolated. But if you can hold your clarity lightly, if you can see without grasping, perceive without controlling, understand without insisting, then your awareness becomes something else entirely. It becomes a space where others can slowly wake up at their own pace, in their own time, without being forced or pushed or judged. Here's what I've learned after years of watching people with this capacity for clear perception. The ones who suffer most aren't the ones who see the most. They're the ones who haven't learned to protect themselves while seeing. They're the ones who absorb everything without filters, who take on every burden they perceive, who exhaust themselves trying to wake up a world that isn't ready to wake up. The ones who thrive, who manage to use their perception without being destroyed by it, they've learned something crucial. They've learned to be in the world, but not of it. They can see clearly without being consumed by what they see. They can perceive deeply without losing themselves in others' experiences. They maintain what you might call a conscious distance, not the distance of cold detachment, but the distance of healthy boundaries. And how do you learn this? Well, it starts with spending time alone, real time, not just physical solitude, but psychological solitude, time where you're not absorbing anyone else's emotions or thoughts or problems, time where you can settle like that muddy water we talked about until you can see clearly which feelings are actually yours and which ones you've been carrying for others. It continues with learning to trust your perception without being ruled by it. Yes, you see that your friend's marriage is struggling. Yes, you sense that your co-worker is deeply unhappy. Yes, you feel the dysfunction in your family system. All of this might be absolutely true, but the question isn't whether you're seeing it correctly. The question is what you're going to do with that information. And sometimes, often actually, the wisest thing is nothing at all, except hold the space for truth to eventually reveal itself. This doesn't make you passive or uncaring. It makes you wise, because you understand that people change when they're ready to change, not when you need them to change. Problems get solved when the time is right, not when you've decided it's time for them to be solved. And awareness develops at its own pace, which is almost never as fast as you'd like. So here we are at the heart of it. The danger of seeing what others don't is real. It can isolate you, exhaust you, make you a target for others' defensive anger, and cause you to lose touch with your own center. But it doesn't have to. Not if you learn to carry your awareness consciously. Not if you develop the strength to see without the compulsion to fix. Not if you can stay true to your perception while allowing others to stay true to their own process of waking up. The gift and the curse are the same thing. The question is just whether you'll learn to hold the gift with enough wisdom that it doesn't become a curse. Whether you'll develop the patience and the boundaries and the self-knowledge needed to be clear without being crushed by your own clarity. And maybe most importantly, whether you will find others who can see as you see, because they're out there. You know, other people who live in this strange space of perceiving more than most, of sensing what's hidden, of knowing what's unspoken. When you find these people, when you can finally be fully seen by someone who doesn't need you to be less perceptive to feel comfortable, that's when the danger starts to transform into something beautiful. Because you realize you're not alone after all. You're not going crazy. You're not broken. You're just awake in a world that mostly sleeps. And there are others who are awake too. And together, without force or pressure or urgency, you can hold space for awareness to slowly expand, like dawn breaking gently over a sleeping city. This is the possibility within the danger, that your clear perception, when held wisely, becomes not a burden you carry alone, but a light you offer to others, gently, patiently, allowing them to approach it when they're ready, if they're ever ready. And if they never are, well, that's their choice. Your job isn't to wake them up. Your job is simply to stay awake yourself, to keep seeing clearly while learning to live peacefully with what you see. The danger is real, but so is the possibility. The possibility that you'll learn to be aware without being consumed, that you'll perceive deeply without drowning in what you perceive, that you'll carry your awareness as a gift rather than a curse. And that is the art of living with eyes wide open in a world that prefers to keep them closed.